Uncle Doug.
Hello.
Here's something I've noticed. There are a few like unified field theories of derp that have sort of come up through our show that we've been able to put our fingers on. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the main ones is that unless someone is talking about a very specific kind of energy, if they use the word energy, they're wrong. They're lying.
Even our former Secretary of Energy was wrong when he talked about energy.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Oh my God, whatever happened to old Rick Perry?
I don't know.
I forgot about him. Maybe he's still in there somewhere.
I think he's lost in the Pentagon somewhere.
Yeah,
Help!
He thought he was going home, but he walked into a broom cupboard and he's still there.
Yeah, he's looking for the 6th side of the Pentagon.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right.
Somebody told him who's over there.
Fucking idiot. And I think Ben Carson is just still staring out a window at the Housing and Urban Development. Nobody's told him it's time to go yet.
Wondering where his luggage went.
So back to the energy. So you guys know I often like to weave some kind of pop culture reference into my segments. And admittedly, sometimes it's a bit of a stretch, like when I used Fats Waller's Your Feet's Too Big to introduce the Japanese foot-reading and bank account-destroying cult Hono Hana Sangpogyo in episode 147.
Right.
But today's subject just went ahead and did it for me. In fact, there are a ton of pop culture references connected to today's very strange man and very strange wooish sort of subject. But let's start with one that will be a love letter to my beloved fellow Gen Xers. In 1985, Kate Bush released an album called Hounds of Love. The first single from it was called Cloudbusting. That's a very pretty song, but I never really thought that much about it. But the music video, which I will include in the show notes, is pretty interesting. It features Donald Sutherland, a very tall, lanky Donald Sutherland, hauling a huge wagon up a hill, pushed from behind by Kate Bush herself in the guise of his 12-year-old son. They get to the top of the hill, remove a tarpaulin, which is a great English word, and expose what looks like an anti-aircraft gun made out of tubas and point it skyward. At the time, to me, it looked like perfectly typical new wave art school music video imagery, right? But it turns out that the boy Kate was portraying was a real person with a name, that being Peter Reich, and the man Donald Sutherland was playing also had a name, Wilhelm Reich, the boy's father. So let us start there with the very bizarre story of Wilhelm Reich and his journey to the top of that hill with his son and their very strange device. Born in 1897 in what was Austria-Hungary, but is now the Ukraine, for the moment anyway, Wilhelm Reich lived a fairly privileged, if highly unusual childhood. I'll get to that in a minute. Until he lost his mother to suicide at age 10, an event he blamed himself for, and his father to tuberculosis at age 14, for which he did not blame himself, luckily. He later served on the Italian front in World War I and then entered medical school in Vienna, where his interest was soon drawn to the budding field of psychoanalysis, which was all the rage in Vienna at the time. He soon became acquainted with a little-known figure, Dr. Sigmund Freud, whom Reich impressed with his eagerness and obvious brilliance, and then he soon found himself, still an undergrad, treating analytic patients in Freud's practice at just 22 years old.
Boy.
With Freud's help, he soon was a full member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Association, and for a young orphan and a very likely PTSD-bearing war vet, he was on his way to an incredibly bright future.
Fun.
And for a while it was. He became a published author, his first book very much impressing Freud and the glitterati of the Viennese psychoanalytic scene. He had his own practice, became faculty at the university, and he continued to develop his own ideas and methods. But Reich's ascendancy was seen as too fast by some other members of the professional community, and they began to bristle at his temper and his arrogance and some of his less than conventional theories and practices. Reich began building off of Freud's idea of the libido, the human sexual drive, and that the ultimate expression of that, the orgasm, must involve the entirety of one's being. This practice led to standard psychiatric talk therapy visits, also including patients stripping to near total nudity, and Reich massaging and pressing on the body to help release what he called the orgasm reflex, as stiffened musculature released pent-up childhood traumas. Now, just a note, I'm going to be talking about some not hideous, but some things of a graphic nature sexually. So if you're listening with your children, consider that. This was fairly shocking to the Viennese psychological community and of the practice, and his young protege. Freud wrote to a colleague, and I quote, "We have here a Dr. Reich, a worthy but impetuous young man, passionately devoted to his hobby horse, who now salutes in the genital orgasm the antidote to every neurosis. Perhaps he might learn from your analysis, Dr. K, to feel some respect for the complicated nature of the psyche." End quote. Take that in for a second. If Sigmund Freud tells you are too obsessed with sex, you might be too obsessed with sex, bub.
Yeah, that's a warning sign.
That's a warning sign. So, this is the sexual bit. About Reich's unusual childhood I hinted at earlier. In his own writing, if his own writings are to be believed, he was quite the early bloomer. He claims to have attempted intercourse with the housekeeper when he was just 4.
Oh, my God.
I can't imagine what that would even be.
Yeah.
He said that he enjoyed watching and participating in sexual encounters with their farm animals, and that he had daily sex from age 11 on with another domestic worker in their house, that at age 15 he began frequenting brothels daily, and that he would pleasure himself to memories of his deceased mother, whose suicide, as I mentioned, he blamed himself for after she caught 10-year-old Wilhelm in sexual congress with the maid.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
I just feel like, the typical response to something like that is paging Dr. Freud, but in this case, it seems not to have worked.
Exactly. He could literally walk across the hall to Dr. Freud.
Yeah.
Now, Reich's own daughter has written that she believes most of these instances were sexual abuse perpetrated on him rather than ones he was interested in having. And, of course, legally, she is correct.
I was about to say.
Yes. But, in her thinking, he spun it to make himself a consenting participant, even the instigator. Again, we know that a 4-year-old nor an 11-year-old can consent to sex with an adult or anyone else.
Right.
And not that this necessarily reflects on any of that, but it's illustrative that he had no less than 4 marriages and more adult romantic affairs than I could count in my reading. So sex was very much at the front of mind for our friend Wilhelm Reich. He was later involved in something called the July Revolt of 1927, when the Austrian police killed 84 strikers and injured almost 600 more. This propelled him into becoming a communist, which led him to open several free clinics in Vienna that offered, and I quote, psychoanalytic counseling, Marxist advice, and contraceptives, which is a potent mix, as we all know.
That's a nice one-stop shop, right?
Yeah, you get everything. That and a sandwich. He also had a mobile clinic that offered those same services in far-flung areas, where they counseled adults, teens, and children about sexuality and sex, and Marxism. Reich went beyond the study of sex and sexuality in teens and children, which is a normal field of psychological study. He was quite a proponent of sex among teens and children. One can imagine how that went over in a very conservative society on the brink of being overtaken by an even more socially conservative Nazism.
Right.
It all became too much. His stock plummeted, and he began a series of years in exile in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway as one job opportunity and professional association after another crumbled until in 1939 he literally caught the last boat out of Norway before the Second World War started and ended up coming to the U.S. I should note that he is Jewish. So he would not have fared well.
No.
Once in America, he began further research on some really wacky ideas, not really related to his actual expertise, that he'd been developing in exile in Norway. There he had begun to believe that there was some sort of observable electrical energy underlying the sex drive. In haphazard experiments, he began heating up bacteria and protozoa mixed with potassium until they glowed, then swore he was observing tiny tubules of light that he called bions. When the superheated samples later showed the growth of bacteria, he declared life had spontaneously sprung into the dead matter from nowhere and that he had observed the actual origins of life in the laboratory. Now, he was no laboratory specialist, and his critics were able to show that this was simply free-floating bacteria in an unclean lab growing on the samples.
Right.
So these slipshod experiments led him to declare he had discovered a kind of invisible, pre-atomic, cosmic biological energy he called Orgone Energy. So pre-atomic energy, by that he means before atoms.
Yeah.
So
right.
like smaller than atoms or predating atoms?
Predating atoms and not made of atoms.
Okay.
Right, the thing everything is made of. So, he had kind of taken a radical new direction. Now, this wasn't necessarily a radically new idea. Spiritualists and scientific hobbyists for more than a century had been talking about this idea, like Mesmer's mid-18th century theory of animal magnetism, or Baron Karl von Reichenbach's 19th century theory of the odic force, something invisible, magnetic, and available only to living things. In many ways, it's the exact idea of the Force in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Before the prequels made it available only to bearers of a kind of royal bloodline, therefore totally fucking the beautiful idea that made the universe magical to begin with. Anyway.
Fuck you, Lucas.
Yeah. But this was 1940, and thankfully most of that spirit ether stuff had been laughed out of the scientific community prior to that. But for an ever more isolated and rejected Reich, it was his new holy grail. He began to build boxes that were basically Faraday cages lined with plywood, insulation, and sheet metal that he said could focus the Orgone energy into a subject seated within, preferably naked, naturally.
Do not go in the booth.
Do not
That's
go
all
in
I'm
the
going to
booth.
say.
And potentially cure a variety of psychological issues and potentially increase sexual potency, power, and pleasure, and very likely cure cancer.
Fuck. Yeah,
Well,
he's
what
gone off
kind of
the
a
deep
woo
end.
would it be if it couldn't cure cancer?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and you can look these up online. They're the Orgone Energy accumulators, and they look like a broom cupboard or like a place you would put pies to cool. They don't look like anything, right? So somehow, this is amazing. He convinced Albert Einstein himself to have a look at his gizmo and give it his seal of approval.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, he did. And apparently Einstein met him and thought he was fantastic. But then, so he sent him one of these boxes. And after a moment of initial excitement, when Einstein thought he found that the temperature inside the box was unusually higher than the temperature in the room, it was discovered that the experiment was flawed, and subsequent experiments found the box was useless junk. And Einstein kindly told him so. An infuriated Reich harassed him with 25 more letters demanding he state the efficacy of the box. Einstein finally wrote back and said, "Leave me alone and keep my name out of your mouth with this garbage theory."
Right.
So Reich kept claiming that his Orgone energy accumulators were a miracle and set up a kind of secret clinic in the basement of his country house in Maine where people, and especially a lot of children, were brought to be, quote, treated.
Oh, boy.
Rumors and reports of sexual abuse of the children by his staff, not necessarily by him, I should point out, became rampant, and he had no license to practice anything in the U.S., whether that be medicine, psychology, or universe energy box cures, people started paying attention. Around this time, he invented another Orgone energy doohickey called the Cloudbuster. So this followed on his claimed discovery of a sinister force called deadly Orgone radiation.
Uh-oh.
So the force had a light side and a dark side, I guess.
Yeah.
But he could overcome it, dispel it, and cause clouds to drop rain on much-needed crops via his Cloudbuster.
Oh, fun.
While it's not as impressive as the very theatrical version in the Kate Bush video, it does still look like some kind of anti-aircraft gun. It's got 15 long aluminum tubes mounted on a tiltable tripod that you can point skyward, with then flexible tubes coming off the back of those that run down into a bucket of water. And that's it. That's the extent of the technology.
Sounds really good.
So
very high tech.
Desperate blueberry farmers offered to pay Reich for his service if he could make it rain. He showed up with his thing, he pointed it skyward, and the next day, it rained. So make of that what you will, but that appears to be the only, quote, successful deployment of his Cloudbuster.
And it so rarely rains in Maine.
Yeah.
Yeah. or Spain on the plane. So
I was going to say the rain in Maine stays mainly in Spain.
in Hartford. What? Oh, no, that's Connecticut. Anyway, I don't care. It's the East Coast. So Reich was becoming more and more of a laughingstock, and his circle continued to shrink to all but cranks and conspiracy cultists. The American Food and Drug Association, that had been sniffing around Reich's absurd claims to cures with his energy accumulator box, pounced on him in 1984 and ordered him to stop selling his garbage and to stop claiming it had any effect. Here is the note he wrote to the judge of the court that was charging him.
You said what year? This is 1984?
No, 54.
Oh, 54. Okay.
54. And remember, the FDA was also one of the big boogeymen for Scientology, right?
Right.
Because they challenged his claims that the e-meter could do all the same shit this thing said it could, cure cancer, yada, 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 and that niacin could cure you of anything. So here's the letter he wrote to the judge in the court that was charging him, which is pretty crazy. My factual position in the case, as well as in the world of science of today, does not permit me to enter the case against the Food and Drug Administration, since such action would, in my mind, imply admission of the authority of this special branch of the government to pass judgment on primordial, pre-atomic, cosmic orgone energy. I therefore rest the case in the full confidence in your hands. Well, the judge used his hands and ordered all the orgone boxes be destroyed and his books be pulled from circulation. Funny
that's
aside,
not how judges like to be talked to.
Yeah, judges, they no thank you. Funny aside, FDA agents were interviewing people who bought his accumulators to see if they thought they worked. And one man said he had no idea, but he wanted to keep his because it worked for having his wife sit quietly in it for 4 hours a day. So there's a little honeymooners-style sexist humor for you, everybody.
Love it.
Straight to the cosmos, Alice. So this caused poor paranoid Wilhelm to deteriorate further. He said he had detected, quote, energy alphas, which were long cigar-shaped UFOs that were, because of course he did, that were poisoning the Earth with chemtrails of bad orgone radiation.
Oh.
He and his young son Peter would hunt them at night with binoculars, then Reich would aim his Cloudbuster at them, claiming to have shot down several of them. It was soon discovered that he was violating the court order by still promoting his boxes and trying to sell them. So in a rather heavy-handed move, FDA agents forced Reich's son Peter, who at this time was like 12, and several colleagues to smash what remaining boxes they had secretly hidden with axes, and then they burned 6 tons of his books.
Whoa.
Even the pre-orgone energy psychological treatises that were kind of in the mainstream, semi-mainstream of psychology, right?
Yeah, that feels like a bit of an overreach.
Yeah, not a day that covered the federal government in glory, if you ask me. He was eventually arrested, tried for fraud and violating the court order, and sentenced to prison, where he died in 1957, leaving the 13-year-old Peter alone with his fond memories of trying to bust clouds and shoot down UFOs with his father, memories he recorded in his 1973 memoir, A Book of Dreams. And that is a book that Kate Bush found so moving she wrote a song and conspired with Terry Gilliam to make the aforementioned music video about.
Oh, he directed that.
He didn't direct, he produced it.
I see.
Oh, wow.
And interestingly, the Cloudbuster in the video was made by the same effects shop that made the Alien for the original Alien. So, and this strange story of the sex-obsessed, exiled rainmaker weirdo left a cultural fingerprint well beyond Kate Bush. He was influential with the giants of the beat movement like William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac, who both mention him. He influenced Norman Mailer and Michael Foucault and Patti Smith, and people like Allen Ginsberg, J.D. Salinger, and Sean Connery had orgone accumulators in their homes.
Wow.
A version of the accumulator is even featured in the work of another sex-obsessed lunatic, Woody Allen. Anyone who's seen Allen's absurdist 1973 sci-fi comedy Sleeper will remember the infamous Orgasmatron scene.
Yeah.
Right.
That's based on an orgone accumulator. And even more batty, it is believed the character Dr. Duran Duran in the almost unwatchable 1968 sci-fi train wreck Barbarella is based on Wilhelm Reich himself.
No kidding.
And the excessive machine he aims to kill Jane Fonda with via overstimulus to pleasure is a nod to the Orgone Energy accumulator.
Wow.
So that's a bunch of bananas that are now yours to know of, everybody.
I thought you were going to talk about cloud busting, which is like there's another woo that is about like being able to use your personal energy to like make clouds disappear from the sky. That I personally have encountered in my life. So maybe we'll have to do that as a companion piece.
Yeah,
to this
his
one
was
at some point.
to cause it to rain.
Yeah, I had no idea. There you go.
But it's so interesting. Like every time we talk about kind of, especially like mid 20th century figures like this and woos, they have such a huge influence in the pop culture as well.
Yeah,
it's kind of crazy how
I'm so glad though that we have found that we've found finally the obvious link between orgasms and rain. I knew that there was one.
Yeah.
But I could never put my finger on what it was, and now it's clear.
And Donald Sutherland. So we tied that all up with a bow for you folks. So that is Orgone Energy and Cloudbusting and Wilhelm Reich, which is not the story I thought I was going to be telling when I started reading about it. That's always how it happens.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Everybody go out there and don't have sex with animals.
Whatever.